Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen Botter. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the moderator for this session entitled Who is Not Counted? Ethno-racial and Indigenous Identities in the Census of Canada, presented by Kevin Manuel, data librarian at Toronto Metropolitan University, and Rosa Orlandini, a data services librarian from York University. We are gathered today from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on the unceded lands of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. However, as this session is being recorded for distribution after the event, I recognize that both those of you in the room and those watching after today may be joining us here from a different place. As such, I encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous peoples' lands and waters near you by consulting native-land.ca. This session will be 20 minutes long, followed by a 10-minute question and answer period. Questions may be asked in person or anonymously via the Padlet, which we'll give you the link later, which will be monitored during the presentation.
Thank you very much. My name is Rosa Orlandini. I am the Data Services Librarian at York University. And we're going to start with a land acknowledgement of our own. Both Kevin and I would like to acknowledge that we are both guests on these lands. And we both reside and work in the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Only take what you need. Always leave something in the dish for everyone else, including the dish. And third, you keep the dish clean. We acknowledge the debt and gratitude to those who were here before us and recognize as guests that we respect and honor the relationship and knowledge Indigenous peoples have on this land.
Thank you, Rosa. So a little overview of our presentation today. So we'll talk about our initial research project with the online guide that we created about ethno-racial data in the Census of Canada. But then we'll also want to put the census itself within a context. So what is the history of the census? Where did this terminology originate from? And then, of course, we want to share with you our research project output. So talk about the publications that we've had the opportunity to produce and are working on this time. And we'd like to end with our own personal reflections of working with this project and working with communities that have engaged with this data as well.
Right, so we're going to go back and forth a lot here. So a little bit more about us. Oh, well, no, that's you first, right?
Yeah, I'll go first.
You go first, so I can go first. There
we go.
Yeah.
So a little bit about me. So I work at Toronto Metropolitan University. So this is formerly Ryerson University. So the name changed late last year. So if you don't know about this, there's a link in here you can read about this. But basically the transformation of the name happened because Egerton Ryerson was one of the main contributors to the residential school system. And so the university felt that it was time, especially with discovery of unmarked residential schools, to change the name of the university. And we work with various Indigenous communities to form a committee and change the name of the university. So for myself, I have a BA in anthropology, an MA in sociology. I'm also the librarian for Black Studies, LGBTQ Studies, and sociology. And I'm also involved with equity, diversity, and inclusion committees for the university. And I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to be involved with outreach and learning with both Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Indigenous communities.
Right, and I'm Rosa Orlandini at the York University Libraries. My pronouns are she, her, elle. And yeah, I, like Kevin, have been working in different capacities in my workplace, mainly focused on Indigenous knowledges. My undergraduate and education was in geography and biology, which had absolutely nothing to do with, well, has some stuff to do with what we're presenting today. But in the last few years, I was working with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to build a database of the precise location of Indian residential schools. And also I attend, and I've been invited to attend many teachings at First Nations communities, mainly in the Anishinaabe territories. And yeah, and also a lot of the stuff that I've been teaching at York is really grounded in foundations of critical cartographies and embedding anti-racist education and getting people to think critically about cartographic information. And that kind of also jumps into data, because that's just sort of a natural progression. We also have another research partner, Alexandra Cooper. She's at Queen's University. She can't be with us today. She's a data services coordinator extraordinaire. She is absolutely amazing, and we all learn many things from us. And her path is quite similar too, and we'll talk a little bit jointly about our paths. So our research goals are to create resources for information professionals and researchers on how to discover anti-racism data sources in Canada. Also, we are using a critical lens approach when looking at data, at the data milieu, and also taking a critical reflective approach on how we go about doing our research. Also, our research goals are to publish peer-reviewed and scholarly publications centered on our research practice and findings, but then also to collaborate with different communities of practice. So just to do a bit of the census and context, and apologies in advance because you're going to get 2 presentations in a row on the census. So the census of the census of population, just as remind people, it is conducted every 5 years. And there's a long form and there's the short form. The short form asks the basic questions about who we are, your gender and age and where you're residing. The long form has all the really rich stuff, and that goes out to 25% of the households, along with the parts of the short form. And so this census thing's been going on for many, many years. It started back in the Nouvelle France during the French regime. Back in 1666, there was this fella named Jean Talon who decided to enumerate a whole bunch of people, settlers only, in the colony of Nouvelle France. And so that was the first census. In the French period and in the British period, there were 89 little mini censuses that were conducted. And the first census, I can't remember, don't quote me on this, but there was a census that appeared during the British mandate, the British regime, where they started to ask questions about people's ethno-cultural backgrounds. And this was actually shortly after the fall of Quebec, or fall of Nouvelle France, and the creation of British Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and all those constructs. Moving forward to Confederation in 1867, the first census under Confederation was in 1870. And then also questions regarding, and then these were conducted every 10 years up until about 1951. Until 1951. In 1951, it started happening every 5 years, which takes us to our favorite topic that data librarians love to talk about, which was the cancellation of the long form. So over to you, Kevin.
All right, thank you very much. So Canada is very unique. We're the only country in the world that does a census every 5 years. So we love data. So most countries only do it every 10 years. But let's think critically about how important it is to have an arm's length, independent national statistical agency. We go back in time to 2011. What happened? So we have the short form, which is your demographic questions, and you have the long form. The long form are those juicy questions that every researcher wants to look at: ethnicity, labor, immigration, all of those things that they want to compare with the demographic variables. So the Harper government at that time decided to cancel the long-form census. This was a politically motivated interference. And the outcome of this was that they created what was called the National Household Survey. And they said, well, you know, you only send out this long-form census to 20% of the population anyways. We'll send it out to 100%. Well, the 20% had been developed so it was representative of every community in the country. But sending it out to everyone on a voluntary basis, right? The other two were mandatory before. Making it voluntary, what happens? Certain populations were overrepresented, which tended to be middle, upper class, non-racialized, upper income, more educated. Underrepresented in this, and what happened to suppress data, right? Low income, lower education, recent immigrants, racialized populations. So if the data is not there, and especially at lower geographic levels, it was suppressed and it was not released. What is the outcome of this? There were certain policymakers at that time that were making statements like, poverty has disappeared, or this community doesn't exist anymore, so let's cut the funding. So fortunately in 2016, the next government that came in reinstated the long-form census. It's been status quo ever since. It's important to have that data to be able to make solid policy decision-making.
So, like librarians, we are started to get questions from students, and there's questions that we get from students that, and our research really came out of George Floyd around that period of time. And we were starting to see an uptake of questions about students wanting to see themselves reflected in their research, positionality within people's research. Also, we were, if you fast forward a little bit into the pandemic years, we also were getting students who were supposed to do original research, collecting data themselves, could not all of a sudden, and had to rely on secondary research. So we got together as our group and stuff like that. But this is an example of a reference question that would make a data librarian's day, right? Which a reference librarian would be like, oh my God, how are we going to approach this? But this is the kind of questions that we get. And so it's, going back to the question, sorry, because there's a whole bunch of factors in this question. So a student looking for data about Black community from the Caribbean that resided in Montreal or Canada from 1921 to present. So we're going to do a fast forward through this very quickly. So next slide, please. So first of all, you have to think about identifying nationality, citizenship, and place of birth. So you have to think about, well, different policies at different times. How is this identified? So for example, if it's somebody from the Caribbean, most Caribbean nations didn't get independence until the 60s into the 70s. So prior to that, their nationality would have been British. Place of birth may have not been captured very well. It might have just said the West Indies. It would have not necessarily been down to the individual country. So you have to think about that when answering that part of the question. The other thing is the ethnic and racialized identities. This changes over time, and this is what's really beautiful about the census, but also uncomfortable, because the way identities are defined is really correlated strongly with the government policies of that particular time. And so the language that was even used changes over time from, for example, tribal or racial origin up until 1941, well, actually, yeah, up until 41, and then ethnic origin, and then the culmination of the creation of the visible minority category to represent racialized identities. So it's interesting because some years in the census, if a person, racialized peoples or persons and individuals are actually represented, you were able to indicate what your racialized identity is. Now we know race is, of course, a social construct, right? But at the same time, it's a reflection of what society actually is. So up until 41, it was there. The language was very uncomfortable. If we look at it through our lens today, it was uncomfortable for people who were filling out the questionnaires at that time. right? But in 51, 71, and 81, racialized identities were completely not on the form. So those individuals were not even they had to write in how their identities, if they chose to indicate or self-identify in that way. So this is classic. In this case, this is a quote from Thompson, who wrote this article, but the article that's cited here. Racialized Jamaican descended respondents reported that they were British, and while those Haitian descendants identified as French. So that kind of gives you an idea of how complex it is. So going back to our research question, it's not really easy to answer, especially in that time period. We go fast forward into 1986. Actually 1986 and onwards, in 1991, 86, because of the Employment Equity Act, the term visible minority was coined. And this was to describe people who racialized persons essentially in Canada. And so from that point onwards, from 1991 onwards, visible minority was a category, and people could then, individuals who were racialized backgrounds could identify where they could self-identify. It was retrospective to 1986 too, so there's a little bit like that going on there. 2021 onwards, there is a more of a reflection going through the anti-racist strategy policies, but also the advocacy of data librarians kind of pointing out to Statistics Canada, saying it might be time to change or think about the vocabulary change. And so there is a change of looking at the concept of visible minority, how it's going to be changing moving forward within Statistics Canada. So our research outputs. And this is over to Kevin.
And just a note about the visible minority, that's Canada only. The only country that uses that term. So, researchers coming to us are having the challenge of comparing data internationally. So with a term that's sort of unique to Canada and categories that are unique, it becomes really problematic to do international comparisons. And the term minority in that as well, is that really so relevant anymore? Like the city of Toronto is over 50% racialized population as well too. So, all right, our research outputs. So this is our initial project. So we go back to the pandemic. This was our little project we were working on, and we had a lot of Zoom meetings to create this. But back in 2020, 2021, there were 4 of us that got together. So Alex Cooper, Maury Davidson, myself, and Rosa. And as she had said, we were getting those reference questions that were asking some challenging questions about, how do I look at ethno-racial data and Indigenous data over time with census information? And how do we provide a tool that explains how to be able to compare that easily? So there's the link to the guide there. You can go take a look at that later. But in more detail, this is what one of the census years would look like. So we have one for each census year back to 1871. And in these documents, there are details about the variables. And just a disclaimer right now as we go forward, there is going to be some offensive terminology that is, colonial and historical. So just be aware of that. So, there were questions that were about ethnic origin, race, and place of birth, and cultural origins. And so these change from year to year. So these definitions will help the research tool to go in and look at where are the records for these. So we provide links to where they can find like individual census records. So that's held back for 90 years. So they can go back to the early ones. I think that's with Library and Archives Canada. They can go in and take a look at those. And then there's also research data that's available that's more on an aggregate level for more recent censuses that doesn't include individual information. And we would like to think that, this is a really great companion piece for the Canadian Census Data Discovery Partnership Guide. Thank you. So these two working together will really help researchers understand how to find the data. So Rosa's amazing creations here with her spreadsheets, and thank you very much. These are on the website as well too, but these explain how to find where the variables are placed in the year. So it tells us where we find that. And so we can see there are some not so appropriate terms referring to the Black community. And that term was actually used up into the 2010 census in the United States. These will help researchers. So that reference question that we have, this guide will be able to help the researcher go back, look at historical data, and locate the information that they're looking for. Also, we have one for Indigenous peoples as well too, so we'll be able to go back over time and find those various terminologies that they're looking for within their research. So an output for our project, we submitted a article to the IASSIST Quarterly, which is the International Association for Social Science and Information Science Technology. It's a large international data community, and they also have their IASSIST Quarterly journal. And there's actually a special issue for anti-racism. And so we thought this was a great opportunity for us to share with the international community about our project. So it's an open access journal. Feel free to go in. It's not very long. But if you are getting those reference questions that are, about ethno-racial and Indigenous data, this is a great article to share with the researchers. So we can go in and take a look at that and explain the context. We've also had a book chapter for an ECR publication recently accepted. So it's Data Culture in Academic Libraries, a practical guide to building communities, partnerships, and collaboration. Same title as today's presentation too, but anyways, essentially. But the three of us are going to continue to expand on the work that we've already done. But really for us, this is a chance to go in further, explain how the project came to be, looking at the online guide in more detail, what our other research outcomes have been from this, and looking for opportunities for future collaboration. So because our online guide is a living document, and as we've experienced, both Rosa and I and Alex, as we share this with communities, and we use this guide in instruction within classes, is that we are being provided feedback from racialized and Indigenous people saying, does this terminology make sense? So, we have to place ourselves within some reflexivity and looking at ourselves. Of course, we're looking at it from a Western viewpoint, but we want to hear other viewpoints. So, we've revised, we've edited the the descriptions on the guide itself to help provide a more holistic view as well. But really helpful diagram here from ResearchGate there, if you want to take a look at that. So we also want to be looking for further collaborations with other communities as well too. So it started, as an Ontario Council of University Libraries project, but specifically within our Ontario data community. So that is a group within OCO, and that was where a few of us again came together, created this project. But it's something that we have regular meetings. We share this with our other members in our group to let them know there's a resource here to be able to share with the research communities. We've also had the opportunity to present and share within the Data Liberation Initiative, which is from Census of Canada. So they have national and regional training where we've been able to share our project with as well. And we've done a presentation already with IASSIST at a conference last year, and another one again this year. And I'm also the program chair for the conference this year. And our theme of the conference is diversity in research, social justice from data. So we have some really amazing presentations there. The conference this year is only $100 online, but there are some amazing diversity topics in there if you want to check that out. And so some future opportunities, we want to continue to keep this as a living document and work with other Indigenous and racialized groups. And so we will certainly be looking for opportunities with that. Again, so when we're looking at anti-racism in data, it's applying that lens, right? Thinking about practice of social justice and advocacy. I know these aren't easy things, but we're working with things that need these explanations and really want to ensure that Indigenous and racialized individuals are supported and encouraged to be in the library professions, but also within the data areas themselves. And again, so as Rosa had mentioned, a big change this year. This is something that I had always gone into classrooms. I had advocated to students and faculty. I said, give feedback to Census Canada. I know your research isn't using that term visible minority. They did change it this year. So from this point forward, Census Canada is going to refer to visible minorities as racialized peoples or groups in their publications. And I've had researchers say to me, what a big difference this makes. I'm able to compare data internationally. I'm able to explain this to my students better. And it has been a really significant, I know it's a data pun, significance change in data research. So thank you very much. We're happy to take any questions right now.
Thank you. If you have any questions for Rosa or Kevin in person, please use the microphone. Otherwise, you can ask anonymously at padlet.com/csconcordia/LRF_2. We have about 4 minutes.
My question to you, and I really don't want to put you on the spot, I know it's very easy. I was wondering how much outreach you have done with racializing and we have also one fantastic guide because we all need to try the main problem. We are asking specific. So I think some city on different indigenous they already there. So that's essentially my question.
The short answer in a broader sense, no, but in the local sense at our own institutions, because that's essentially where that's where the catalyst is. Both Kevin and I have done workshops specific to this topic where we assist graduate students and faculty members with finding data about racialized populations or data about Indigenous peoples and individuals. And so from there, it's very much a snowball effect within the community. I mean, we're Toronto-centric in this case, but it's very much within the Toronto academic community and also the Queen's community. So yes, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we're working towards that. There's VIMWalk, for example, that we could work with and other colleagues and stuff like that. But also we've got input from our colleagues as well at different stages of our project. So it's a question of communication. You know, I'm not on social media or anything like that, but we'll figure it out. Yeah. But Alex, thank you so much for the suggestion. Anybody else brave enough to ask a question? Awesome.
No.
Yes.
I understand how, you know, the fine tuning of the terminology is becoming like more and more vital, and how the data that is collected is quite empowering, especially if you have people who are looking to do work on communities that aren't usually discussed or that haven't been historically. But I wonder if you ever think about the census as this kind of state apparatus in and of itself, Because I'm thinking of the example that you brought up of Jean Talon, kind of only counting the settlers in his community, but part of the reason might be because, Indigenous populations of the area are still kind of outside of his colony or establishment, and how bringing them in and kind of wanting to count everybody is also part of a nation building project.
You just nailed the critical words.
Okay.
Yeah, the census was a colonial project. It was constructed to collect information about how the country was being settled, how it was being expanded. Why we say it's not counted, because a lot of people were being ignored in that process. But where it is today, it could do a lot more. I think a big change that happened in 2021 was that gender identity was included. I've asked them to include sexual orientation. Their response is it's a sensitive topic, which is not good enough. The UK census last year asked sexual orientation, so there's a precedent for this. But we also have to acknowledge that there are communities that do not participate in the census. There's a small number of Indigenous communities that don't participate, but that comes down to Indigenous sovereignty and data protection from them. That's what my presentation will be at the IASSIST conference, is talking about. It's called Indigenous Data Matters. What data, how do you find data that is not included within the census itself? Yeah, very good point.
Thanks for a great presentation. I'm wondering if there's other data that you could incorporate into this project. And what I'm thinking about particularly, I worked at the Provincial Archives of Alberta for many, many years, and homestead records, which all three prairie provinces would have a lot of information about where immigrants came from and the size of their families and stuff like that. And certainly it's wonderful data for genealogists. I can still do a homestead search. But I'm just wondering, there's little pockets of data collected for different reasons, probably all over the place. And I'm just wondering, I mean, it's a huge task, but would there be, the task is not over, it's going on. I'm just wondering. And the other question I'm wondering is if the Department of Indian Affairs, or whatever they are calling it now, has data on Indigenous folks.
So I'll unpackage this twofold. Because census is the primary instrument, we decided to focus in on that, but we're looking more at the contemporary data sets about contemporary Canadian society for the most part within our research guide, but also recognizing that since census is the primary instrument, we did go back into time with the census. There is scope within that, but it also has to do with the expertise of the people who are contributing to the research guide itself, because our research guide focuses predominantly on, it does focus on the census data, but it's also looking at data that's being contemporaneously created by provincial governments, but then also municipal governments, and then also other nonprofit groups or other agents and other areas as well. So it's really a contemporary look, but there is completely, I mean, if somebody wants, and I know those homestead records, but also there's the immigration records, for example, too, right? But that's really in the realm of digital humanities. And a lot of those records are still locked up in, people haven't even done the OCRing of those records. So that's a long ways away.
I tried to be slow. I guess that's it for our session. Thank you.